There is a kind of anger that does not arrive because awareness has been lost, but because awareness has finally reached somewhere it was once unable to remain. You look backward at an experience you survived, a relationship you accommodated, a compromise you repeatedly made, and suddenly the explanation that once allowed you to live with it no longer works. Nothing about the past has changed, yet your relationship to the past has changed so completely that it can feel as though the event has happened again. What you once called normal begins to look painful. What you once called patience begins to look like self-abandonment. And what you once called understanding may reveal itself as the explanation you needed in order to keep functioning. Anger often enters precisely at this distance between the consciousness that endured an experience and the consciousness that can finally see what the experience required. This is why anger can intensify during periods when a person expected themselves to become more peaceful. Awareness does not only reveal beauty, connection, possibility, and love. It reveals cost. It shows you what certain forms of belonging demanded from you, how often you silenced yourself to preserve a relationship, how much energy was spent making another person's behavior understandable, and how frequently your own discomfort was translated into something easier for everyone else to tolerate. Before this becomes wisdom, it may become outrage, because the nervous system is encountering information that the mind once kept organized through accommodation. The anger is not necessarily evidence that something new has gone wrong. Sometimes it is the emotional consequence of something old becoming newly visible, and visibility has its own grief. When you can finally name what happened, you may also recognize how long you could not name it, and the anger begins moving in more than one direction. Part of you may become furious with the person who crossed your boundaries, another part with those who walked without intervening, another with the environment that taught you to normalize it, and still another with yourself for having stayed. These forms of anger can become tangled together until the entire past appears to demand a verdict. Yet the person looking backward now possesses capacities the person living through the experience may not have possessed then, and forgetting this creates one of the cruelest distortions that expanded awareness can produce. You can become so clear about what you would do today that you begin condemning yourself for what you could not do yesterday. You imagine that because the pattern is obvious now, it should have been obvious then. Because you can establish the boundary now, you should have established it then. Because you would leave now, you should have left then. But consciousness cannot use tomorrow's capacity retroactively. The version of you who remained may have been frightened, dependent, conditioned, attached, financially constrained, emotionally overwhelmed, trying to protect children, trying to preserve a family, trying to survive loneliness, or simply unable to imagine another way of living. Responsibility can ask what your participation contributed without pretending you possessed resources, knowledge, or freedom that you did not actually possess. This distinction matters because self-responsibility and self-punishment can sound remarkably similar inside an angry mind. Self-responsibility says, I can see where I abandoned myself, and I do not want to continue doing that. Self-punishment says, I abandoned myself, therefore I deserve contempt for having been that person. The first converts awareness into a different future. The second uses awareness as a weapon against the past. One creates capacity while the other creates an internal courtroom in which the present self continuously prosecutes an earlier self for not having already become who the present self is. Growth becomes strangely violent when every new level of understanding is used to humiliate the consciousness that existed before it. There is another complication, because the people involved in your past may not change simply because your understanding of the past has changed. You may recognize a dynamic that another person still considers normal, remember an interaction they barely remember, or finally understand the significance of something they have spent years minimizing. This can create a powerful desire to make them see what you now see, because recognition from them appears as though it would complete the recognition occurring within you. You imagine that if they admitted what happened, understood its effect, apologized correctly, or finally saw the pattern, the anger could rest. Sometimes those conversations are meaningful. But when your internal clarity becomes dependent upon another person's agreement, the person who once participated in your confusion can unintentionally become the gatekeeper of your resolution. You are allowed to understand something that another person never understands. You are allowed to change your relationship to a history even when someone else continues telling the old version of it. You are allowed to establish a boundary without successfully persuading everyone that the boundary is reasonable. This does not mean dialogue is unnecessary or that accountability should never be requested. It means your ability to recognize your own experience cannot permanently depend upon winning consensus about it. There are truths that become stable not because everyone finally agrees with you, but because you no longer require disagreement to destabilize what you have carefully examined. Anger becomes especially dangerous when the need for recognition turns into the need for submission. At that point, being understood is no longer enough. The other person must confess, concede, suffer, regret, or experience the same emotional reality you experienced. The desire is understandable because pain often contains an instinct towards symmetry. If you could feel what I felt, perhaps the world would become balanced again. But retaliation rarely produces the balance it promises, because causing another person pain does not return the years, restore the abandoned boundary, recreate the lost opportunity, or give an earlier version of you the protection they needed. Anger can correctly identify that something was unequal while being completely wrong about what would make it equal. This is where allowing anger becomes different from obeying it. To allow anger is to let the body register the force of what has been recognized without immediately demanding that the force become behavior. You may feel heat, agitation, violent language inside the mind, the urge to send the message tonight, the desire to expose someone, confront everyone, end a relationship immediately, or declare a permanent conclusion about an entire period of your life. The intensity is real, but intensity is not instruction. An emotion can deserve your full attention without receiving command authority over your next action. There is enormous maturity in discovering that you can feel something completely without expressing it completely. This is not suppression, because suppression requires you to deny, shame, or disconnect from what is happening. Restraint simply refuses to confuse authenticity with discharge. You can say, "I am furious," without deciding that fury should choose your vocabulary, your timing, your audience, or your consequences. You can wait before responding without betraying yourself, and you can leave the room without surrendering the truth that made you angry. Sometimes the most faithful response to anger is not immediate expression, but creating enough space that the information inside the emotion can separate from the impulse attached to it. That separation matters because anger frequently contains both signal and story. The signal may be extraordinarily precise. Something crossed a boundary. Something important was dismissed. Something cannot continue. A relationship is no longer reciprocal. A promise was broken. Or you have been participating in a pattern that diminishes you. Around that signal, however, the mind may rapidly construct conclusions. They never loved me. Everyone has used me. Nothing in that period was real. I wasted my entire life. Nobody can be trusted. I should have known. They deserve whatever happens next. The presence of a valid signal does not make every story generated around the signal equally valid. Learning to honor the signal while examining the story is one of the ways anger becomes intelligence rather than ideology. This can be difficult because certainty feels stabilizing when you have spent years doubting yourself. If you were repeatedly told that you were too sensitive, confused, dramatic, selfish, ungrateful, or mistaken, the sudden arrival of anger may feel like the first internal voice strong enough to oppose those messages. You may therefore become protective of the anger itself, fearing that questioning any conclusion means returning to self-doubt. But discernment is not the same as invalidation. You do not have to distrust yourself again, in order to acknowledge that a wounded mind can perceive something accurately and still exaggerate what that accuracy means. This is one of the places where spiritual language can quietly become another form of abandonment. A person begins feeling anger and immediately reaches for forgiveness, compassion, higher perspective, soul agreements, lessons, destiny, or the belief that everyone was doing the best they could. Any of these ideas may eventually become meaningful, but timing changes their function. A truth introduced before an experience has been honestly encountered can become anesthesia. Compassion offered too quickly can protect you from hatred while simultaneously protecting someone else's behavior from being clearly named. You do not need to transform anger into love before you are willing to understand why it came. You do not need to forgive on a schedule simply because forgiveness sounds more evolved than fury. And you do not need to turn every injury into gratitude in order to prove that you extracted wisdom from it. Sometimes the most conscious sentence available is much simpler. That hurt me, and I should not have had to pretend that it didn't. Remaining there long enough for the sentence to become real may be more transformative than covering it immediately with a philosophy about why everything happened. Yet anger also cannot become the final home simply because it was the first emotion strong enough to tell the truth. There is a stage in which anger gives a person back the energy that accommodation consumed. They stop apologizing for every boundary, stop explaining every refusal, stop negotiating against their own knowing, and discover that a firm no can exist without an elaborate defense. This can feel almost intoxicating after years of powerlessness, because the person is experiencing force where they previously experienced collapse. But the purpose of recovering force is not to remain permanently armored. It is to regain enough internal protection that vulnerability no longer requires self-erasure. Often something quiet awaits beneath the anger once that protection has become trustworthy. There may be grief for the years that cannot be returned, sadness for the younger self who believed endurance was love, tenderness toward the person who kept adapting because adaptation was the only strategy available, or disappointment that someone you loved could not meet you where you needed them. Rage may have stood at the entrance because these emotions once felt too defenseless to encounter directly. Anger gave the psyche enough structure to approach them without collapsing. When the softer emotions begin appearing, this does not mean the anger was false. It may mean the anger has finally made it safe enough for the rest of the truth to arrive. And this is where the path becomes more demanding than either suppression or expression, because now you are being asked to hold several truths without forcing one to eliminate the others. Someone may have harmed you and still possess humanity. You may have participated in a destructive pattern without deserving what occurred within it. You may understand why another person behaved as they did without accepting the behavior. And you may forgive something eventually without restoring access to the person who did it. Awareness becomes deeper when it no longer needs innocence and guilt to be distributed perfectly before it can decide what must change. There is still another movement hidden inside this, because eventually the question is no longer only what anger says about the past. The more consequential question becomes what the anger is asking you to stop reproducing in the present. It is possible to become exquisitely aware of every person who failed to protect you while continuing to abandon yourself in smaller, more socially acceptable ways today. It is possible to speak fluently about old violations while still saying yes when you mean no, remaining silent to avoid disappointing people, over-explaining boundaries, or waiting for permission to trust your own discomfort. At some point, anger must be allowed to turn its face away from the history it has illuminated and toward the life that is still being built. Because what is revealed about yesterday becomes most meaningful when it changes what you are willing to participate in tomorrow. And what you are willing to participate in tomorrow may be where the deepest meaning of the anger finally becomes visible. It is one thing to recognize that someone repeatedly ignored your boundaries. It is another to notice the moment you are about to ignore your own boundary because keeping the peace still feels safer than disappointing someone. It is one thing to understand that your voice was diminished. It is another to hear yourself beginning to soften a truth before anyone has even challenged it. The past can teach you where the wound formed, but the present reveals whether the old arrangement is still operating through your own behavior. This is where anger stops being only a reaction to what happened and begins becoming information about what can no longer be repeated. For a while, this can make a person unusually sensitive to anything resembling the old pattern. A small interruption feels larger than an interruption. An unanswered message feels larger than an unanswered message. And a careless remark can activate the accumulated force of years in which similar moments were tolerated. This does not mean the present event is meaningless, but it does mean the present event may be carrying more emotional weight than it created by itself. Awareness has begun detecting the pattern faster than the nervous system has learned to distinguish resemblance from repetition. The person is no longer asleep to what once happened, but they may not yet be fully free from expecting it to happen everywhere. That stage deserves careful attention because hypervigilance can disguise itself as discernment. After spending years missing warning signs, you may become determined never to miss one again, and this determination can feel like wisdom because it is organized around self-protection. You begin reading tone, pauses, facial expressions, delayed responses, inconsistencies, and changes in behavior with extraordinary intensity. Sometimes you are seeing accurately, and sometimes you are watching so closely for the old danger that ambiguity itself begins to feel dangerous. The correction for having trusted too easily can become trusting nothing that has not first proven itself innocent. Awareness does not mature by moving from blindness into permanent suspicion. It matures by becoming capable of seeing risk without requiring risk to be everywhere. This is a subtler form of strength because certainty is easier than discernment. Certainty says, I know what this is, while discernment can say, something in me is responding strongly, and I am willing to investigate before I decide. That pause does not return you to passivity. It allows present reality to receive a fair hearing instead of forcing every new person to stand trial for everyone who came before them. This is particularly important when anger begins reorganizing relationships. People who benefited from your previous accommodation may experience your new boundaries as hostility, selfishness, distance, or unnecessary intensity. Someone accustomed to receiving an immediate yes may interpret your pause as rejection. Someone accustomed to unlimited access may experience ordinary limits as abandonment. Their discomfort does not automatically mean your boundary is wrong, just as your anger does not automatically mean your boundary is right. Growth requires tolerating the unsettling space in which another person's disappointment is no longer sufficient evidence that you have done something harmful. For many people, this is harder than confrontation itself. They can finally say no, but afterward they spend hours wondering whether the no was cruel, replaying the conversation, drafting explanations, imagining what the other person thinks of them, and feeling compelled to reopen the boundary simply to relieve the guilt. The old pattern survives not because the boundary was never spoken, but because the nervous system still interprets another person's displeasure as an emergency. Anger may have provided enough force to establish the limit, yet the deeper work is learning that the limit can remain even after the anger subsides. A boundary that exists only while you are furious is not yet fully yours. This is why anger sometimes appears repeatedly around the same issue. It may seem as though the emotion refuses to leave, when in fact you keep requiring anger to perform a task that eventually needs to become ordinary. You become angry enough to protect your time, angry enough to say no, angry enough to stop explaining yourself, angry enough to leave a conversation that has become disrespectful. But if anger must be summoned every time you protect yourself, self-respect has not yet become structurally available without emotional emergency. Integration gradually removes the requirement that you reach the edge before you are permitted to honor yourself. There is a profound difference between a boundary created from rage and a boundary that remains after rage has passed. Rage may say, "You will never do this to me again," while mature self-protection eventually becomes quieter. "This is not something I participate in anymore." The first often needs the other person to understand the force behind the boundary. The second does not require an audience. It is no less firm because it is calm, and no more authentic because it is loud. The deepest boundary may eventually feel almost uneventful, because you are no longer negotiating internally about whether you are allowed to have it. This quietness can initially be confusing. If anger has been the emotion that helped you recover your agency, then becoming less angry may feel suspiciously similar to becoming passive again. You may wonder whether compassion means you are minimizing what happened, whether peace means you are slipping backward, or whether no longer thinking about the injury means you have somehow excused it. But healing does not prove itself by maintaining the emotional temperature at which recognition first occurred. You do not have to remain furious in order to remain clear. In fact, sometimes the persistence of anger begins serving a different function from the one that originally brought it forward. At first, it revealed what you could not see. Later, it may help you avoid what you do not want to feel. Anger can be easier to inhabit than grief because anger contains motion, argument, energy, and an object toward which attention can be directed. Grief asks something different. It asks you to encounter what cannot be argued back into existence. There are years that will not return, apologies that may never arrive, parents who may never become what you needed, relationships whose potential will never become their reality, and versions of yourself you cannot go backward to rescue. This is where rage sometimes becomes exhausted rather than resolved. You have rehearsed the argument enough times to know every sentence, imagine the confrontation in every possible form, explain the history to yourself until the facts are undeniable, and still something hurts. The mind keeps returning to the case because it assumes a better argument will eventually remove the pain. But some pain remains after the argument has been won because the pain was never asking for a verdict. It was asking to be mourned. Grief changes the architecture of anger because grief does not require an enemy in order to be legitimate. You can grieve what someone did without reducing that person to what they did. You can grieve your own choices without turning yourself into the villain of your history. You can grieve a relationship that needed to end while still remembering what was beautiful within it. And you can miss someone you should not return to. These combinations can feel intolerable when the mind is seeking a clean moral arrangement. But emotional maturity increasingly allows reality to remain complicated without using complication as an excuse to abandon clarity. Sometimes you are angry precisely because you loved. If nothing mattered, betrayal would carry no force. If you expected nothing, disappointment would have nowhere to land. Anger can therefore contain evidence of attachment, hope, investment, loyalty, and the future you once imagined with another person. This is why simply commanding yourself to let it go can feel impossible. You are not releasing one emotion but encountering the remains of an entire meaning structure. The anger may be guarding the place where something precious was lost, and until that loss is recognized, attempts at peace can feel like another demand to pretend it was never precious. This does not make anger sacred. It makes anger contextual. The emotion may be carrying information about love without every action it proposes being loving. It may be carrying information about injustice without every judgment it produces being just. It may be protecting grief without knowing how to grieve. When you understand this, you no longer need to choose between worshiping anger and rejecting it. You can become curious about what it is protecting while remaining responsible for what you do in its presence. Responsibility becomes especially important when anger feels morally justified. The more certain you are that someone else was wrong, the easier it becomes to believe that your own behavior deserves less examination. Cruelty can begin calling itself honesty, humiliation can call itself accountability, retaliation can call itself a boundary, and the desire to wound can hide inside language about speaking your truth. The fact that another person violated your humanity does not make their humanity irrelevant. If your awakening requires permission to become what wounded you, then the pattern has changed sides without actually ending. This is not a demand for softness toward people who remain dangerous, manipulative, or unwilling to respect limits. There are relationships that require distance, endings that require firmness, environments that should be left, and conversations that do not need another attempt. Compassion does not require access, and understanding does not require reconciliation. You can recognize someone's wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them, and you can understand the conditions that shape their behavior without making those conditions responsible for governing your future. Sometimes love becomes most honest when it stops pretending proximity is always virtuous. The same is true inwardly. Understanding the conditions that shaped your own behavior does not mean refusing to examine the harm you may have caused while you were hurt. A person who discovers that they were silenced can still become controlling when they finally find their voice. Someone who was abandoned can punish others for needing space. Someone who spent years powerless can begin using power carelessly once they possess it. Pain explains many things that it does not excuse. Awareness becomes trustworthy when it can extend the same principle in every direction. What happened to me matters. What I did because of what happened to me also matters, and neither truth has to erase the other. There is tremendous freedom in reaching the point where you no longer need innocence in order to deserve compassion. You do not have to prove that every choice you made was the only choice available, that every reaction was justified, or that you never harmed anyone while trying to protect yourself. You can acknowledge where fear became control, where hurt became harshness, where avoidance created consequences for others, and where anger was used badly. Accountability becomes less threatening when it is no longer confused with exile from your own humanity. You can take responsibility without constructing an identity out of your worst response. And this begins changing the question that anger asks. Early in its emergence, the question may be, how could they have done this? Then it becomes, why did I tolerate this? Later, if the process continues deepening, another question appears. What kind of person do I want to become now that I know what this feels like? That question does not erase the first two, but it removes your future from their custody. Your life begins organizing around what you are creating rather than remaining organized around what you are opposing. This is where the energy inside anger can become unexpectedly useful without remaining anger forever. The force that once wanted to destroy a connection may become the force that builds a different life. The refusal that first appeared as rage may become devotion to honesty, better relationships, clearer boundaries, or a more faithful relationship with yourself. Energy does not have to retain the emotional form in which you first encountered it. Fire can become direction once it no longer needs to prove that something burned. But even this movement contains another difficulty, because as anger loosens its grip, identity can begin loosening with it. You may have spent months or years understanding yourself through what happened, through what you survived, through the person you escaped, through the system you rejected, or through the truth you finally recognized. That identity may have been necessary while you were reclaiming reality from confusion. Yet there comes a point when continuing to define yourself primarily through what wounded you gives the wound a different kind of permanence. And this is where the teaching begins asking something more difficult than whether you have a right to your anger. It begins asking who you are becoming when anger no longer has to remind you who you refuse to be. And when anger no longer has to remind you who you refuse to be, you encounter a question that anger still cannot answer. Who are you when opposition is no longer organizing you? For a time, refusing the old life may have been necessary because refusal created distance from patterns that once felt inevitable. You knew yourself through what you would never tolerate again, whom you would never become again, and which doors you would never reopen. But a life built entirely around never returning is still oriented toward the place it escaped. Eventually, freedom has to become more than distance from the past. It has to become participation in something the past is no longer defining. This is one reason anger can remain after its original work has been completed. The emotion has become familiar enough to function as orientation, and without it, there can be an unexpected emptiness. If you are no longer arguing internally with someone who hurt you, what fills the hours that argument occupied? If you are no longer proving that you deserved better, what do you begin building with the energy that proof required? People sometimes mistake this emptiness for a regression because the intensity that accompanied awakening has diminished. Yet the absence of emotional intensity may not mean awareness is disappearing. It may mean awareness is becoming ordinary enough that it no longer needs crisis to remain present. There is a difference between discovering a truth and learning how to live after the discovery. Discovery can happen in an instant. You suddenly understand the relationship, the family pattern, the compromise, the betrayal, the years of self-abandonment. Living after that understanding is slower because your routines, expectations, reflexes, relationships, and sense of self were constructed before the discovery arrived. Anger often belongs to the moment when insight outruns embodiment. You can see farther than you can yet live, and the distance between those two realities creates its own frustration. This is why you may know exactly what the boundary should be and still struggle to maintain it. You may understand that you do not need someone's approval and still feel shaken when they withdraw it. You may recognize manipulation while still experiencing the old impulse to explain yourself, or understand that a relationship has ended while continuing to imagine the conversation that would finally repair it. None of this cancels the clarity. It reveals that understanding is only one layer of change, and that the body often requires repeated evidence before what the mind knows becomes what the person trusts. Anger can become impatient with this slower process. Once something is visible, you may expect yourself to behave as though it has always been visible, and every return of an old reaction feels embarrassing. You think, I know better than this, as though knowledge should immediately erase conditioning. But the deepest patterns were not created by explanation alone, and they are rarely dissolved by explanation alone. They were learned through repetition, relationship, consequence, adaptation, and survival, which means another form of repetition is often required before a different response begins feeling natural. There is therefore no contradiction in being deeply aware and still being triggered. Awareness changes what becomes possible inside the trigger. It does not guarantee that the trigger never arrives. The old surge may still appear. The body may still tighten. The familiar story may still begin assembling itself. And anger may still rise before you have consciously chosen anything. The difference may initially be only a few seconds in which you recognize what is happening before becoming completely identified with it. Those few seconds can seem insignificant compared with the intensity of the emotion, but they are the beginning of a new relationship to it. Over time, the space can widen. You begin noticing anger before sending the message rather than after, before escalating the conversation rather than during the apology, before deciding what another person's behavior means rather than after the conclusion is hardened. This is not emotional detachment. You may still feel the full force of the experience. What changes is that awareness remains present inside the force instead of returning only when the force has passed. You are no longer required to leave yourself in order to feel strongly. This may be one of the more useful ways to understand integration. Integration is not the disappearance of difficult emotion, but the end of the arrangement in which difficult emotion temporarily removes you from your own values. You can be furious and still know that cruelty is not who you want to become. You can feel betrayed and still recognize that you do not have enough information to make every conclusion your mind is proposing. You can want retaliation and simultaneously know that wanting something in a moment of pain does not obligate you to create the consequences of having done it. There will be moments when this restraint feels unsatisfying because anger often wants completion immediately. It wants the conversation tonight, the answer now, the apology now, the decision now, because activation experiences uncertainty as unfinished danger. Yet some of the most consequential choices available to you become clearer only after the emotional weather has moved enough for more than one part of you to speak. Waiting does not mean the anger loses its vote. It means anger is no longer the only voice present when the decision is made. And sometimes, after waiting, you will discover that anger was right about what needed to change. The relationship may need to end. The boundary may need to become firmer. The truth may need to be spoken. Or a situation you have repeatedly excused may finally need to be left. Regulation is not a technique for convincing yourself to tolerate what should not be tolerated. Calmness is not valuable if its only function is returning you obediently to the same conditions that produce the anger. The purpose of creating space is not to weaken truth, but to separate truth from the urgency that can make truth difficult to use wisely. Other times, waiting reveals that the anger was responding to something real, but interpreting its meaning through an older wound. Someone's distance may genuinely have hurt without meaning they were abandoning you. Someone's disagreement may genuinely have felt dismissive without meaning they do not respect you. The emotion was not fake simply because the first interpretation was incomplete. This distinction is essential because many people believe they have only two choices: trust every feeling as literal truth or distrust themselves entirely. There is a third possibility in which feelings are treated as meaningful evidence that deserves investigation rather than unquestionable verdicts that end investigation. That position requires a kind of self trust deeper than certainty. Certainty needs to know immediately what happened and who was right. Self trust can tolerate not knowing while remaining unwilling to abandon what it feels. You can say, "Something about this affected me strongly, and I want to understand why," without immediately deciding whether the entire cause belongs to the present, the past, yourself, or someone else. This gives anger room to become more precise. What first arrived as "everything is wrong" may eventually reveal the much more useful truth that one particular thing is no longer acceptable. Precision changes the way anger moves through relationships. Instead of accusing someone of never caring, you may discover that what needs to be said is that one behavior cannot continue. Instead of condemning an entire relationship because one boundary was crossed, you can examine whether repair is possible, whether the crossing was accidental or repeated, and whether accountability follows when the effect is named. This does not make you easier to mistreat. It makes your protection more accurate because you no longer have to destroy the entire landscape in order to defend one part of it. There is power in becoming specific enough that anger no longer needs exaggeration to be believed. "This hurt me" does not need to become "everything was a lie." "I should have been treated differently" does not need to become "nothing good ever happened." "I cannot continue this relationship" does not require "you are an entirely terrible person." The mind often reaches for absolute language because absolutes create emotional certainty, but reality does not become more truthful because every shade has been removed from it. Sometimes the strongest recognition is the one capable of remaining precise, even when precision leaves complexity intact. This is also where forgiveness can eventually be understood differently. If forgiveness becomes relevant at all, forgiveness does not have to mean deciding that what happened was acceptable, restoring trust, reopening access, forgetting consequences, or feeling affection towards someone who harmed you. It may simply mean that your life no longer needs to remain emotionally organized around collecting payment from a debt that cannot be paid in the form you once imagined. You stop requiring the past to become different before allowing the present to become yours. Whether another person participates in that release is a separate question, and there are things you may never forgive in any conventional sense. You may understand them, cease obsessing over them, build a peaceful life beyond them, and still consider them wrong. There is no spiritual law requiring you to manufacture tenderness toward every person or event that wounded you. The demand to forgive can become another way of policing legitimate human experience when it treats emotional resolution as a moral performance. What matters more deeply is whether the injury continues governing your choices long after the person who caused it is no longer present. This is where anger begins losing its roles as evidence. You no longer need to remain angry to prove that what happened mattered, because the boundary itself proves you learned from it. The way you speak now proves it. The relationships you choose prove it. The situations you leave earlier prove it. And the kindness you no longer confuse with self-erasure proves it. Your life becomes the record of what you understood. Anger can then soften without taking the truth with it. There is something almost tender about this stage, because you may begin seeing the earlier angry version of yourself differently as well. Instead of being ashamed of how intense you became, you can recognize that intensity as an imperfect attempt to recover something important. Perhaps that version of you overreacted sometimes, misread people sometimes, spoke too harshly, or believed things that later required revision. But they were learning how to stand after years of bending. And people learning to stand do not always discover balance immediately. Compassion does not rewrite what they did. It understands the conditions under which they were trying to become someone capable of doing differently. Eventually, this compassion may extend backward even farther toward the person who had not become angry yet, the one who stayed too long, explained too much, apologized first, kept giving another chance, or mistook endurance for maturity begins looking less like someone you should despise and more like someone doing the best they could with the structure available to them. You may even recognize that their capacity to survive is part of what allowed you to become the person capable of questioning the survival strategy. The self who tolerated and the self who rebelled are not enemies competing for ownership of your history. They are different moments in the same consciousness learning what protection, love, responsibility, and freedom actually require. And then the anger becomes part of a larger movement rather than the defining event within it. It was the force that made certain truths impossible to ignore, but it was never meant to become the permanent lens through which every future relationship would be viewed. The deeper achievement was never becoming someone who could no longer be hurt, provoked, betrayed, or angered. It was becoming someone who could remain present when anger came, hear what was true within it, question what was distorted within it, protect what needed protection, repair what could be repaired, and refuse to turn pain into permission for harm. Perhaps this is why the spiritual path does not eventually remove your humanity in the way you may once have imagined. You may become more aware and still become angry, more compassionate and still establish boundaries, more loving and still leave, more peaceful and still recognize injustice immediately. Awareness does not make you less human. It asks you to become increasingly responsible for the human being you already are. The measure is not whether difficult emotions stop visiting, but whether every emotion must become your identity while it is present. And when anger visits again, as it sometimes will, you may begin meeting it without the old panic about what its presence means. You will not have to call yourself regressed because heat rises in your body, nor call yourself enlightened because the anger seems justified. You can recognize that something in you has been activated and become interested in what deserves attention before deciding what deserves action. There will still be moments when you get this wrong, moments when you speak too quickly or wait too long, moments when an old wound borrows the face of a new situation. But even those moments can become part of the same learning when awareness returns without immediately converting error into shame. Because the deepest change may not be that anger disappears. It may be that anger no longer frightens you into suppressing it and no longer seduces you into surrendering yourself to it. It becomes something you can sit beside long enough to hear clearly, something powerful enough to reveal where life has become misaligned, but not sovereign enough to decide what truth requires of you. And once you can remain there, neither fleeing the fire nor becoming the fire, you may begin noticing that anger was never only asking you to understand what happened. Beneath it was a quieter question that had been waiting for enough strength to become audible. Now that you can see clearly, how will you live?
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.